Nobody expected a routine flight to turn into a public spectacle, but when an airport employee decided to play politics, she picked the wrong person to mess with. Barron Trump had spent his entire life under public scrutiny. Every move he made, every word he spoke, twisted, dissected, and analyzed by people who knew nothing about him. But he had never been denied service because of his last name, until now. He had arrived at the airport without security, without an entourage. Just another traveler, dressed in a sharp but casual blazer, carrying nothing but a small bag and his boarding pass. It was supposed to be simple, a flight, a seat, a few hours in the air. But the moment he approached the check-in counter, he saw the look in the woman's eyes. She recognized him, and she didn't like what she saw. Barron handed over his passport and ticket, his expression calm as always. The woman, a middle-aged airline employee with a name tag that read Karen Simmons, took one glance at his ID and immediately frowned. "Oh," she said, her tone dripping with disapproval. "You're one of those Trumps." Barron raised an eyebrow. He had dealt with this before. The passive-aggressive comments, the fake smiles from people who secretly hated his family. But this was different. Karen didn't even try to hide her disgust. Barron stayed silent, waiting. She tapped at the computer in front of her, scrolling unnecessarily, pretending to check something. Then she sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "I'm sorry," she said, loud enough for people in line behind Barron to hear. "But it looks like there's an issue with your ticket." Barron's eyes didn't move from hers. "What issue?" Karen leaned forward slightly, her smirk barely hidden. "It appears your reservation was flagged." A few people in line whispered, some pulling out their phones. Barron stayed perfectly still. "That's interesting," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "I booked this flight 2 weeks ago, directly through the airline." Karen shrugged, feigning innocence. "I don't know what to tell you, sir. Maybe it's because of, well, you know." She let the words hang. Barron's expression didn't change. This woman wasn't just refusing to let him board. She wanted a scene. She wanted to humiliate him. She wanted him to argue, to get angry, to explode, so she could have a story to tell. Barron wasn't about to give her one. He took a slow breath. "I see," he said, his voice as measured and unreadable as ever. "So I assume the airline has a policy against serving certain passengers based on their last name?" Karen flushed slightly, glancing around. Some of the passengers in line were listening closely now. One man dressed in a business suit crossed his arms, clearly waiting to see how this played out. "I never said that," Karen said quickly. "You didn't have to," Barron replied, his voice steady as stone. Karen hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard, trying to figure out what to do next. Barron could feel it now, the shift in the air. She had expected him to react. She had expected him to storm off or lash out. But instead, he was watching her, letting the moment drag out, forcing her to sit in her own discomfort. "Look," Karen finally said, her voice sharper now, irritated that he wasn't giving in. "I'm just following procedures. If you have an issue, you can take it up with corporate." Barron smiled slightly. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low but firm. "I will." Karen let out another exaggerated sigh. "You're free to book another flight, but this reservation won't be reinstated." There it was. She was officially barring him from boarding. A few people muttered in shock, and one woman in line stepped forward. "That's not right," she said, shaking her head. "He had a valid ticket." Karen shot her an annoyed glance. "Ma'am, this is none of your business." The woman narrowed her eyes. "I think it is when I see someone getting discriminated against because of his last name," she said. Karen's jaw tightened. Now she was in trouble. This wasn't just about Barron anymore. Other passengers had seen what happened, and the longer this went on, the worse it looked for her. Barron tilted his head slightly. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she lifted her chin, doubling down. "Absolutely," she said. "Now please step aside. There are other customers waiting." Barron nodded once. He picked up his bag, turned around, and walked away without another word. But Karen had no idea what she had just done, because by the time Barron reached the other side of the terminal, his phone was already buzzing with messages. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because by the next morning, this little power trip of hers was going to cost her everything. By the time Barron Trump reached the other side of the terminal, his phone was already buzzing nonstop. He ignored it at first, but when he finally glanced down, he saw what he had already expected. Someone had filmed the entire encounter. The video was barely 2 minutes long, but it had already racked up tens of thousands of views. People were talking, and they weren't happy. Barron stood near the large glass windows of the terminal, watching planes take off in the distance while scrolling through the comments. This is blatant discrimination. She needs to be fired. Barron handled that like a pro. The reactions were immediate, swift, and completely in his favor. He had done nothing but stand his ground, kept his composure, and yet the airline employee had made a fool of herself. A new notification popped up on his screen, a missed call from his mother. He knew she had seen the video, knew that somewhere in the world Melania Trump was probably sitting in a quiet room, arms crossed, debating whether she should call him again. Before he could decide whether to answer, another alert appeared, this time a headline. Barron Trump denied boarding by airline employee. Was it political? It had already spread to the news, faster than even he expected. Barron sighed, rubbing his temple, then walked toward a quieter area near a charging station. He plugged in his phone, knowing it was about to be working overtime. Just as he suspected, another call came through. This time he answered. "Mom, where are you?" Melania's voice was firm, direct. "I'm still at the airport." "I saw the video." "Of course you did." There was a brief pause. "Are you all right?" Barron smirked slightly. "I think I should be asking you that." "This is not funny," she said. "They are going to keep pushing you, testing you, hoping you react. They'll be disappointed then." Melania sighed through the phone. "Do not engage with them." "I didn't, and I won't," he assured her, "but I don't think they're ready for what happens next." After hanging up, he turned his attention back to the video, watching as the view count climbed by the second. He knew exactly what was coming next. The airline would issue some weak excuse, maybe a generic apology. They'd try to shift blame, act like it was just a miscommunication instead of what it really was. He didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, an official statement from the airline was released. He clicked on the link, already expecting the nonsense inside. "We are aware of the incident involving a passenger and one of our employees. We are looking into the situation and will ensure that all of our customers are treated fairly." It was a joke, a pathetic attempt at damage control. Barron exhaled, shaking his head. They really thought this would go away, except they didn't realize something. The situation had already gotten too big. The video had gone viral, and the internet wasn't going to let it slide. He glanced at his notifications again. Political commentators, journalists, business moguls, people who normally stayed out of this kind of thing, they were all weighing in. "This is unacceptable," one well-known businessman tweeted. "Politics should have no place in customer service." "I don't care what your personal beliefs are," another journalist wrote. "If you're discriminating against passengers based on their last name, you don't belong in that job." And then, just when Barron thought things couldn't escalate any faster, another video surfaced. Not from a passenger, not from someone in line. This time it was airport security footage, and it showed everything. The timestamp was from just minutes before Barron had walked up to the counter. Karen Simmons, the airline employee who had denied him service, was laughing with a co-worker. Then, clear as day, she leaned in and whispered something. "Watch this. I'm about to make a Trump throw a fit." Barron watched the clip twice, then closed his eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. She had planned it. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some random miscommunication. It was a setup. And now, she was about to pay for it. The leaked footage spread like wildfire. News outlets that had initially tried to downplay the situation were now scrambling, trying to backpedal their narratives. The same people who had rushed to Karen's defense were now slowly deleting their tweets, pretending they never took a side. By the next morning, the airline had no choice. They released a second statement, this one very different from the first. "After reviewing additional footage, we have identified a clear violation of company policy. The employee in question is no longer with our airline." Karen Simmons was fired. Her career, over. The people who had spent the last 24 hours defending her were now throwing her under the bus. And her former employer? They had cut ties with her the second she became a liability. The irony wasn't lost on Barron. She had wanted to make him a spectacle. She had wanted to humiliate him, turn him into some privileged kid throwing a tantrum. Instead, she had humiliated herself. Barron sat back in his chair at a different gate, this time waiting for a new flight with a different airline. He glanced out the window, watching another plane take off, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. This wasn't about getting someone fired. It wasn't about proving a point to the media. It was about showing people exactly how the world worked. People like Karen thought they could act with impunity, that as long as they targeted the right people, no one would care. But they had forgotten something. Truth has a way of surfacing. And Barron, he didn't even have to raise his voice to win. As his plane finally took off, he turned off his phone, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes. This fight was over, and he hadn't lost a thing. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.